So if you want to learn more about control of work and how to apply best practices for safety on your projects, listen to this conversation between myself and Shaun DeVille.
You're listening to the Industrial Commissioning Association podcast, where we discuss best practices for industrial plant process and energy system commissioning. Get ready to say no to outdated industry norms and say yes to improved project performance. Here's your host, Paul Turner.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show today. Glad to see everyone here. Today, we've got a very special guest. We're very lucky to be joined by Shaun DeVille. Shaun is one of the world-renowned industry experts on control of work. And it is such a pleasure to be able to spend a bit of time and get information from Shaun on his processes and how he applies control of work to make sure that projects are safe, because everything that we do on projects needs to be safe, right? We want everybody to accomplish work safely so that we can celebrate the success at the end. Hi, Shaun. How are you today?
I'm wonderful, and thank you for that introduction, Paul. I appreciate that.
It's a real treat to have you here today, and I'm sure the audience is going to get lots of value from the discussion that we have today. So how about we start with you telling the audience a little bit about yourself and what you do?
All right, so Shaun DeVille, I'm currently with Rev 1. We said we wanted to give Martin a shout out. So right now I'm working with Rev 1 on the Shell Vito water flood project in the Keywood Yard, which is in Ingleside, Texas, right? But my career started 20 years ago. This October 20 years ago would be when I started in the oil and gas, and it all started when BP Thunder Horse listed, and then they had a logistical incident, and that's how I got started in October of 2005. Since then, I have commissioned, probably 9 deep water facilities, including 1 FPSO, which was considered ultra deep water. I've been on 3 LNG projects and 1 methane project that was in Donaldsonville, Louisiana. So over the past 19, 20 years, I've got to have a mix of backgrounds in oil and gas.
So that's fantastic. You've clearly got a lot of experience in the industry. And for anyone watching live, be sure to add your questions or comments into the chat, because we will have a live Q&A at the end of this discussion where you can ask Shaun questions and get him to give you industry expertise on your specific questions. So just shoot your questions in the chat and we'll make sure we get them answered at the end here. So just so that we know that everyone watching, we're all talking about the same thing, what is your definition of control of work, and why is it so fundamentally important on projects?
Okay, so in my mind, control of work encompasses the whole thing, including SIMOPS, permit to work, and lockout tagout. Okay, so the reason that's so important is because once the formal handover from construction happens, commissioning starts, and that goes all the way until the handover of operations. In my opinion, the reason that's so important is because during that phase, you don't have just geographical hazards anymore. It becomes a much more dynamic environment, whereas in the construction world, your hazard is probably going to be someone's working overhead, something's going to fall on you, etc. It's a geographic hazard. Where in commissioning, I can now turn a switch on, and a half a mile across the facility, someone could get injured, right? So it's much more dynamic, it's much more involved, and that's why it's so important to control that from the handover and to the handover to operations.
Now, the commissioning team is relied on heavily because, like you said, the construction folks, they might not necessarily be as familiar working in that operational environment. So it's critically important that the commissioning team is kind of that guide or that expert to make sure that other folks that aren't as familiar working in an operational environment are kept safe in the work that they're doing.
Absolutely. And that starts very early on. You have an opportunity to have, a safety stand down, a safety stand up, whatever you want to call it. And it's just creating awareness that in the commissioning environment, right, you want to treat everything as live. And getting construction folks to understand that sometimes can be challenging, but you want to make sure that you communicate to them, look, this pipe could have hydrocarbons in it, could have pressure. This electrical device could now have power to it. So what you want to do is get started as early as possible. You get them involved, and it all comes down to your training and making sure that your awareness campaign, you're teaching them that everything can now be live.
You're right, because we want to collaborate with all groups on the project to make sure that everyone's safe. So it's critically important, particularly at that construction to commissioning transition. So when people are making this transition, where do you see most projects go wrong? Where do projects struggle with this transition, or where do they get kind of stuck up or not quite the level of control of work processes that you would expect to see?
So in my opinion, I feel like when commissioning, you want them there as early as possible, in my opinion, at site, okay? So what I see lately, the trend is commissioning not being there as early as they should be, okay? The other part of it is not starting your processes as early as you should, even if construction or operations and everybody, they're not particularly participating, you could still add value by go ahead and having your first time ops meeting, okay? Letting folks know you're there, to start networking with the people as early as possible so that you can start getting everybody set up for the commissioning campaign that's coming. Okay, so the earlier you can get the site, the better. And the other is trying to get construction to buy in, because they're so busy with punch lists and trying to finish their scope and doing whatever, to take an hour out of their day for SIMOPS or for them to come to your morning meeting and vice versa. Sometimes it can be difficult to get them to buy in as early as possible. They don't see the value, but it's coming. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, yeah, because the transition doesn't just happen overnight, right? There's definitely an overlap period of construction and commissioning, and it's going to take some time to make this transition and get everybody on board with this new working environment.
Completely agree.
As the transitions are taking place from construction to commissioning, from commissioning to operations, how do these ownership of safety processes take place during construction? The construction groups would be managing their construction safety, like you mentioned, overhead hazards or slip, trips, and falls. But how does that safety role transition, and who owns this very critical role as the project progresses?
All right. So in my mind, the factor that determines who owns what is going to be the formal handover through whatever completion system that you're using. Okay. So if a system has been completed, you do your walk down, you have a formal handover, and now commissioning takes over. That is the responsibility of commissioning from that point on until the formal handover to operations. And so it's important to understand how your completion systems work. Is it a subsystem? Is it a system? Is it an area that you're doing? And it's commissioning's responsibility to control whatever is handed over and keep those people safe from there on. So you do that through, your live campaign. You're going to go out there. You're going to put tags on everything. You're going to put locks on certain things. You're going to put banners. The awareness campaign is to let folks know, okay, now commissioning owns this system, and it's our responsibility that from here on out, this is going to be permit to work. This is lockout, tag out, and that's what you have to train these people to see.
And what does that look like when you say commissioning owns that system, say for two areas next to each other, where one is under commissioning and one is under construction? What does that look like for adjacent work areas, or say construction groups need to get back into an area to address deficiencies? What does that look like?
All right. It can mean a lot of things. So you could technically take over a system, and what you're going to do is, that pipe, for example, you might have it wrapped in commissioning on tape. You might have locks in place with commissioning on signs. So sometimes it can just be a system. Sometimes it can be an entire electrical building where you're going to have signage on the outside of, both doors. When you go inside, all of your panels are going to be labeled commissioning on. And then typically, like in the LNG world, you have blocks that you'll take over, right? So at some point, if enough systems are owned within that area, you'll put up temporary fencing, and now you're, okay, commissioning owns this. So, but what you want to do in the commissioning world is be respectful that construction still has activities that are going to be, they need to be finished, okay? So if construction wants to start participating in the commissioning on a subsystem or an area, they have to be properly trained, which takes time, right? We're aware of that. So we want to make sure that our systems, our areas that we own, you want to work with construction. They can still work under a system without a permit as long as commissioning doesn't own it, right? So if you can just take over systems in the area, they can still do work in 3/4 of the area. But if you make the decision, okay, well, we're going to go live in this whole area, now they have to participate. So it's a game of give and take with construction to try to figure out what's best for a project. Do we take the system? Do we take the area? Do we take the whole building? So it's a decision that's made basically on the schedule, but it's going to impact construction no matter what.
And that's sometimes often that isn't realized or understood, is that the work environment definitely does change as we get into this operational environment. And it can sometimes be a little bit slower maybe than construction folks would like, but it's for a reason, to keep everybody safe. Now, you mentioned permit when construction or when commissioning owns a certain area. How does that permit to work process work for folks that need access to an area under commissioning's control?
All right. So it can work several different ways, but typically what we do is if we take over a system or we take over an area, okay, the first thing that has to happen is the folks that are going to be working in these areas, they have to have training. That typically starts with like an orientation where we have just an awareness campaign where if the project has committed to purple, say for commissioning ownership, okay, so these folks are going to come to the facility already knowing that purple means commissioning owned. That is just strictly awareness. Then you have different levels of training for permit to work and for lockout tagout. So you may have folks that are going to be working underneath a lockout tagout. They're going to have a certain level of training before they can go in that area, before they can work on that system, right? So that's that. Then you have folks that can actually write lockouts. They can, submit lockout to the commissioning group, et cetera. So it's all going to be about your training up front and how, what construction needs to do. And that's how you control that area, like with the permit to work with the lockout tagout. And the same thing happens with permits. Some people, they're going to be there for one day. They're a vendor. They don't need the whole everything. Like they're going to be sponsored by commissioning, but they are going to work on our lockout tagout. So if we know ahead of time what groups are coming in, what they need, we can help you with lining them up with the right level of training, not wasting their time, et cetera. So that's what we're going to do from the commissioning standpoint of how to get these people in the permit to work and lockout tagout.
Now, when you say purple could be used to identify under commissioning's control, what does that look like? How does the identification of purple look like out in the field?
Okay, it can look a lot of different ways, but typically what that means is anything that you see purple, we want construction to know that means live or commissioning owned. So it could be, for example, you could walk up to an electrical building and you'll see a purple owned, commissioning owned sign, okay? It always typically will say permit to work required along with that, right? So you could see that, and then you go in that building on the outside of a panel, you're going to see a purple sticker. If you in the field, if you see a valve that's locked out, you're going to typically see, if you have an isolation point, but you'll also see either a purple sign or you'll see you can actually see like what we call custody locks, they're not isolation points. But what they are is they're just identification of systems that are owned by commissioning. So you could see those on valves, you could see those on breakers and MCCs. But anywhere you see purple, we will even put purple ribbon or barricade tape around certain areas until we put those fences up, et cetera, if we're talking LNG. But yeah, we can put those purple barricades too for the area as well. But yeah, purple indicates live and that you have to have permit to work and lockout tagout for commissioning.
I've seen red rope areas, I've seen yellow rope areas, and a purple ribbon roped area would make perfect sense as well, just to let people know that there's something more going on here than just static equipment.
Right. So what we want to do, what we teach and we want to train folks to understand is purple should be treated, or I'm saying purple, but it could be whatever color you determine, right? But if you see purple, we want you to treat that just like red, except the only difference is you're allowed in the purple as long as you have an approved permit, right? But otherwise, we want you to treat it just like red because, just like you said, you have real hazards in that area that are just as serious as red barricade.
Now, when there's multiple barricades between multiple areas in systems that are in all sorts of different stages of construction and completion, there's a lot going on all at the same time, which SimOps comes into play when there's adjacent areas that are doing different operations. So what does the SimOps process look like, and how do you communicate that on site?
All right. So what we do is we have a daily meeting, which is typically at 2 p.m., could be 3 p.m., depending on what suits your best, what's best for the site, right? I typically like to do 2 p.m., but what we do is we have a meeting which includes all disciplines. It's going to include all of the disciplines from construction, of course, mechanical, electrical, and instrumentation from commissioning, and then operations, whatever is deemed necessary. And we're going to meet together. And what we do is we prioritize work, based off of obviously safety, but then there's folks in the room that can also make schedule decisions, right? We got to know what's priority. But what we do is we look at work for that night, and we look at work for the next day. So for the next 24 hours, basically, we leave that meeting knowing what work is going to be allowed first. So, we'll know, okay, well, your area is going to have the red barricade up. We can't have two of them at the same time. So based off the schedule or whatever is priority, or this vendor's here for a certain time, that's how we do it in that SIMOPS meeting. And that occurs every single day, 7 days a week. And we go over the night and the next day.
For some of the earlier processes for Haz ID processes, how does that feed into your SIMOPS processes?
Well, for example, let's just say you're going to be energizing a building for the first time. Okay. Hopefully the right people were involved in that Haz ID. So when it comes time to energizing that building, we already know, and we've already had our Haz ID and hopefully identified most of our hazards, including with engineering, et cetera. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a meeting right before we decide to energize that building. We're going to go over the action items that were identified. And then what we're going to do in that SIMOPS meeting, and even ahead of time, we're going to share that information with all disciplines, with the site. What I do is every day, whenever we finish the SIMOPS meeting, before I leave, hopefully by 4:00 every day, I send out any information, any minutes from that, the entire meeting, the agenda, everything is sent out every single day to every single person across the site as far as communication goes. So hopefully, we would have said, okay, this building is going to be energized. We also have a NOPE system, which we can talk about later, which is a notice of energization and pressurizations that we'll talk about. But yeah, all those things are going to be used to communicate what you're just talking about in the Hazard ID.
Now, there's a lot going on at the end of the project. Commissioning is very fast-paced, multiple systems in various stages of completion. It's super fast-paced, and that's why we love it. But there's a bit of a back and forth here to make sure that the urgency of the project, the pace is kept up versus the necessary processes that must be adhered to for control of the work. So how do you balance that schedule pressure versus the need to follow these processes to make sure everybody stays safe?
So let me give you an example just in the LNG world. Okay, what I like about LNG. Very, very early on, the beauty of LNG is you can start making money with only having roughly 20-25% of your plant actually commissioned, right? So what they do is they'll give you these RFSU or these blocks, okay? So they'll say, okay, we only need one power island. We only need, one pretreatment. We only need one storage tank, one berthing station. So even before you even get to site, you already know what the client wants to achieve, okay? These are the blocks that we're going after. So as the SIMOPS manager, I have plenty of time and I can paint the picture to my entire group. Okay, this is what the client is going to want to go after first, because this is how we're going to get first gas, right? So it can start as early on as possible. But to me, the sooner you understand the big picture of what the client is going for, then I can paint the picture to my group. And then I can make them understand that when all these other disciplines come to them, they want this system because it's involved in this RFSU or it's involved in this block. So this makes sense to everybody. And that's my job as the manager to paint that picture to everybody so that they understand that.
With a very complex sequence of overlapping activities where, like you said, you might have 20% of the plant in service and operational while another 20% is still under construction with commissioning
Absolutely.
phase there as well. So it's a very controlled process for that reason, right?
Absolutely. Yes. And if the client can identify that with the schedule, then I can do a better job because, the reality is, Paul, like people look at SIMOPS permit to work and lockout tagout as slowing down the process. Okay. And to be fair, sometimes it happens that way because it's about keeping people safe and having integrity and doing what's right. Okay. And sometimes that happens. But at the same time, is we can understand like what the goal is, where we're headed. We can do a really good job up front by planning, prioritizing, understanding, and so yes, we are there for that reason, but also we can add value as long as we understand. And like if you have a flare lockout that's coming up with 1,200 locks, guess what? Then I can have my night people start working on that. I mean, there's so many things that I can do as a SIM ops manager to help the schedule as long as I understand and that we communicate that, right?
And that's key, is that early planning, because this is a very complex process and it definitely needs to be controlled. But imagine if it wasn't controlled, then there's probably very little chance of actually hitting the client's objectives and targets of 20% in service at that point in time, because the site would be complete chaos.
Absolutely. And I mean, to me, Paul, it all starts in the early planning phases. Okay. I mean, I'll be honest with you, the last couple of jobs I've been on, they have listened to the number of personnel that were requested. They were dynamic, they were ever changing. Anytime we needed to update our system, our permit to work system, we had an opportunity to do it. Single source agreements with vendors where we had an open PO versus having to wait 6 weeks for material. Whenever scope changed, okay, we're going to focus on electrical buildings. I need a lot of electrical locks and a lot of electrical people. Anytime something changed, the client was very reactive or proactive as well. And we worked together, and it was just really, it all works great as long as the client is involved and they're helping you do things like that. Something as simple as a single source agreement and not having to wait on material, you're able to change just as fast as the project is, right? Those are so many things that you can do to help get the project keeping on schedule.
Now, you mentioned 1,200 locks. That's a lot of locks to coordinate on a daily basis. And I think people would generally be familiar with lockout tagout. That is at least a function that they hopefully have on their projects. But what does the lockout tagout process look like in relation to commissioning and control of work?
It's a huge part of it, to be honest with you. And the way that I look at a properly planned lockout tagout, so I'm a big fan of custody locks, which we talked about. You're going to have your commissioning own color, right? So let me just explain what that means. So you have individually keyed locks, which 99% of your locks are like that. And then you have key to like locks, okay? Now, we're talking about commissioning. Operations does a different type of system. They use batched keys. They use batch devices. We don't do that. Commissioning, everything is individually keyed, okay? So whenever, let's just say we inherit an MCC, we're going to do right away is we don't want to energize anything downstream of that while someone's working on that, correct? So what we're going to do is you will walk up and you will see a cubicle and it will have a hasp on it, which is intentional. And you'll see whatever color you chose, let's say purple, you'll see a custody lock on there saying commissioning on, and then you'll have your actual isolation lock, which in my opinion is more than likely going to be yellow, okay? And that's your isolation point that doesn't allow any electricity downstream of that. So a good lockout tagout program, in my opinion, I like to see color discipline locks. So when I go in the field, if I see yellow, that's going to be electrical. If I see blue, that's going to be mechanical, right? Green could be instrumentation, however you want to do it. But you always want to have in my opinion, your disciplines separated so that you'll know. And then it's commissioning's job to put custody locks on everything too, so that you know this is what's on. So we will intentionally put hasp on for that reason. And we will intentionally put hasp on because we don't allow piggybacking, that's what they call it, of lockout tagout. So each task is going to have its own lockout tagout because you can get in trouble that way, right? If someone needs to do work on a system and someone's working on it, but now you just prevented that from happening. Like you're not going to have people working on the same system. You're going to have different lockout tagouts to allow them to protect themselves. But I like color discipline locks. I'm a big fan of custody, whichever your commissioning own choice. So to me and then obviously making sure you have enough personnel, some that specialize mechanically, some that specialize electrically, and then utilizing your night shift as well if you do have a night shift. That to me, that's what a good lockout tagout program looks like.
And I think it needs to include both individual lockout and group lockout in cases of larger jobs too, where there's lots of people locking on to the same protection system. Like you mentioned, 1,200 locks. I imagine a good portion of those are all locking on to the same system.
Yeah, so I can give you, there's two choices that you have right here for what we call a satellite box, okay? So there's a couple of reasons that we use it. So one, what will happen is you have an actual isolation, okay? It might only have 6 lockout points, okay? So what happens is that person running that lockout tagout, he might have, 10 people working on that job, right? Well, there's a couple of reasons. He doesn't want all those people to be coming in, putting personal locks on the box. And plus, we don't need that kind of traffic for, the 200 jobs that we have open. We just don't have that much space for those people to be coming in here, right? So what happens is, like you're saying, we will take that lockout. The team lead will put a lock on that box. That key goes into another box, and then there's another lock that goes on there, and then they take that to their employees. So like you're saying, we can issue a satellite box for those group locks to where now they take that to the field, and each one of those employees is going to put a personal lock on their key, so there's no way anyone's getting in that box. So you can do that through a group lock form or an actual satellite box. I like the satellite box personally.
Now, this needs to be very well choreographed and very well orchestrated across all of the sites, across all of the disciplines, across all of the work groups. Where have you seen this break down, or what's an example you can share where there was a near miss or lessons learned, and what did the group take out of it?
All right, so I can give you, this is probably one of my, if anybody's worked with me, they probably know this story, but I have a very serious lockout tagout story that happened when I was working on an FPSO, and I don't know how much people know about that, but they weather vane, right? They're really unique. They're typically used in an area that doesn't have an integrated pipeline, so this was the ultra deep water project I was telling you about, right? So in this situation, because of the weather vaning and because of personnel on board, the POB limitations, right? We had a diving campaign that was coming up. So because we couldn't have all these divers on board, we decided that the diving vessel was going to moor on the side of our vessel while we weather vaned, and they were going to dive. That's the way we're going to do it. They weren't going to stay on board. They were going to have their own vessel, okay? So leading up to this, I worked for a year with this diving company and planned the whole thing out, because I don't know if you know how dynamic a diving campaign is, but it is very, very planned out, and everything is redundant, and I mean, it's difficult to manage, right? So long story short, I signed a piece of paper saying that I would represent the divers that are on that vessel on the facility, because they couldn't come over there, and that any lockout tagout I would be responsible for, and I would witness personally myself. So it came down to our first time to dive, right? I mean, this was a huge milestone for the project, and I went to the control room, and I'm maybe one of 14 people, are working for the client itself, and everybody else is foreign and from a different company and everything. So I walk into a control room, which is very intimidating, and I say, okay, I want to look at the lockout tagout, and guess what? A gentleman proceeds to take a stack of papers, fling them in my face, and start saying some stuff in a different language that obviously was not very kind to me. And it was very intimidating, very hostile. And I was just like, okay, well, we're not going to proceed with this diving campaign until you let me see this lockout tagout, right? Because there was a specific thing that had to be locked out called a sea chest, which allows water into the vessel and could technically suck a diver into the, what I'm saying? So that was like the most important thing that I was worried about. Well, we sat there, it got worse and worse. I went back to my office. I called my boss in Houston. I said, listen, I'm not going to allow this diving campaign to start until they let me physically look at this lockout tagout, right? It wasn't just enough for me to see it on a piece of paper. I needed to. Well, a few hours later, some gentlemen come in with like huge lengths of chain and radios and all this stuff, and they're like, let's go. So we go, and I'm not exaggerating. This is an old Suezmax vessel, like from the 80s, that they converted into an FPSO. We went down a set of stairs. Somebody would stand right there, another set of stairs. And then we went down, and I mean, it took like an hour and a half to get to where we were looking for. And there was a huge manual valve at the bottom of this FPSO that had to be manually put in place and locked out. And it was not locked out. And they were assuring me in the control room that they were ready to put this diver in the water, that I physically signed a piece of paper saying I would represent him, right? And guess what? It wasn't locked out. And I saw why. I saw how difficult it was. But here we are. We come back up hours later, and now the lock's in place. We proceeded with the diving campaign. But it's just an example of there are people, and not everyone has the same level of integrity. And as a sign ops manager on a project, I sincerely feel like I am the integrity of that project and those processes from that phase, like we talk about, like from handover to handover. I truly feel like that's my job, and that is my responsibility to be the backbone and the integrity of the project. And that was just one example of where it broke down, and they didn't see the importance of it. But, also for the past year, it was literally one of the only things that I was focused on, right? And so I saw it from a different perspective. And that is my story that I have, where I've seen a real breakdown where someone could have really been hurt.
And this is precise work, like you said, that took a year's worth of planning to make sure that it's done safely, right? This reminds me of presentation we saw from Keith Parrish on commissioning of the James Webb Space Telescope. This is precise work where people's lives are on the line and expensive equipment is on the line. And it does take some thought and planning to make sure that these things take place safely. Keith's line was, do all the planning that you can, including planning for a bad day. And by taking that personal integrity upon yourself, you made sure personally that this was safe before the work could proceed.
Sure, absolutely.
So in this situation, there's obviously pressure. They didn't want to take the time to implement the lockout tagout. There's always that schedule pressure. People want to go ahead with the work and unfortunately maybe try and take some shortcuts. So how do you balance that culture of safety versus making progress on the project, especially when the pressure is high?
Yeah. So one, our department, we're always going to have the attitude of, we want to be part of the solution and not part of the problem, right? However, what works best is having a system that puts up boundaries and checks and balances in the way. So what we do typically is we'll have like a 10 a.m. cutoff, okay, to where you need to submit your permit and your lockout tagout to us, to my department, for the next day, okay? So 10 a.m. cutoff, that gives us time to look at the permit, review the permit, make the lockout, tag out, etc. And we have everything ready to discuss in the SIMOPS meeting to where we're going to plan that night and the next day's work. So we usually have a 10 a.m. cutoff, discuss it at 2 p.m. If that doesn't happen, then you don't get to go to work that night or the next day. However, when I say we want to be part of the solution, if the commissioning lead, commissioning manager, and if he will sincerely back me up with that, and get people to understand we do this for a reason. If we have an incident and it shows that we walked through a permit and we didn't go to SIMOPS, we didn't discuss it like we needed to with all the disciplines, that could be a really big deal, right? So whenever you and your commissioning manager have a relationship up front to where he respects me and I respect him, so what on the flip side of that, if he comes to me or he sends someone to me and says, listen, we got a vendor here, we're paying $2,000 a day, I really want to get this done, or, and I'm like, okay, I understand. If we can do it safely, we will absolutely do it safely. So it depends on the relationship you have with the commissioning manager and them showing respect for you, and then you also showing respect to the schedule, and then allowing those types of opportunities to move forward as long as it's done safely. So it works both ways, in my opinion. But typically, you want to have the cutoff, the meeting that day, but you can walk through things that are done safely.
Right. A very structured process. And as long
Correct.
as everybody knows the process and can follow the process, then they'll be able to complete their work when they need. It just takes a little bit of upfront planning and
Correct.
expertise to make sure that you're following the right processes to make sure the work is taking place safely.
Correct. Very much so. I agree.
So for any of the project leaders that are out there that are listening to everything that you're saying, but maybe feel that they're falling a little bit behind on what their control of work should look like on site, what's the first thing that they should do right now? What's your advice to them?
So it can mean a lot of different things. It depends on, like, where are you talking about in the project? Are we talking about what you can do up front, in the middle, or at the end? Because I can give you a bunch of examples of what we did, if you want, not specific to any of those, but are you talking specifically to any part of the project?
Often the case, commissioning is thought about a little bit too late in the project. So let's maybe use the example of somebody where commissioning is approaching and this conversation is maybe enlightening them on some things that they are behind on getting ready for as on-site testing is starting.
Okay, so let's talk about personnel. Obviously, you obviously can always add people, right? If you know you have a lot of lockouts that are coming up, you can add, if you have the time to do this, but obviously you can have the right personnel. You can also utilize your night shift very much to where, as we're like, say we're talking about that 10 a.m. cutoff, right? But as long as we discussed it in SIMOPS, it might be a huge lockout that at least we can discuss it and say, okay, we're going to go to work the next day. But the lotto, even though it wasn't finished, I'm going to let my night personnel finish it. So we come in the next morning, it's complete. I mean, there's ways that I can work and help that. I've seen them specifically bring in a contractor that only had electric specialized people to do a ton of electrical lockouts that have come up. It can be, like we talked about, the single source agreement. If it's talking about material and the time that it takes to do that, that's definitely something that I would recommend for every single project. It is huge and it saves so much time and effort. I mean, and there's just so many things that you can do. But yeah, utilization of night shift is one of the biggest things. And then depending on what kind of permit to work system you have, there are certain things that you can do where I've seen to where we've said, okay, well, the system doesn't do this, but I can work with them and they're able to change the things that we want to do for the project. And so you can actually enhance, we call them enhancements on your electronic permit to work system. If you're working with someone, I don't want to say any specific names, but if you're working with someone that has an electronic permit to work system, you can do enhancements, which I've seen were very successful on moving the project forward. Sometimes they take time, yes, but if you can get them done, they absolutely add value. Example would be de-isolation for tests. Some of these systems, they're not made for that. If you can enhance that and then you allow de-isolation for tests, then you can do that. So there's so many things that like that within their system that can speed things up for you.
This was excellent, Shaun. I want to thank you for going through and answer these questions. I can see there's a whole bunch more questions in the chat here. So maybe let's go through some of those and see if you can help out some of the people that have questions in the chat. And as we're answering these questions, for anyone that's listening, if you have a question, shoot it in the chat, because now's your chance to get industry expertise from Shaun. He'll be able to answer your question. So the first question we have is from Actor, and he is asking, doesn't the contract spell out these responsibilities?
I would say yes. I mean, as far as when we're usually up front in Houston or New Orleans and we're identifying, there's basically 3 documents that we're going to put together. Typically what we do is we take existing documents, we redline them to be fit for project, right? But that's not always the case. Sometimes you're starting from scratch. But yes, usually between your SIMOPS, your permit to work, and your lockout tagout procedure, those are going to be the 3 documents that are going to define these responsibilities ahead of time. So, and what you do is you bounce those back and forth between yourself and the client until everything is agreed upon. So yes, when you get to site, you should typically have all of this spelled out.
Daniel's got a good comment here. Once the construction is still ongoing, we need to commissioning part of the system and subsystems. So that's a good point on systematization, because that's a key part of the transition of systems through this control of work process. So what's your advice or what's your best practices when it comes to systematization from a control of work perspective?
Okay, so one of the examples I can give, let's say electrically, if you hand over a panel too early and you still have construction activities, as in you still have 3 cables that need to be terminated. And again, listen, this is from a management perspective and a project, what's best for a project. You can do it both ways, okay? So yes, you can accept a panel, and yes, you can move forward with, it does allow you to move forward with some testing and some things you can do for commissioning. However, you may face some challenges in the future by doing that, where you're going to have to shut off your building, or you're going to have to shut off power to whatever. So you can go back and let construction punch this, finish this punch list item or do. So it's really from a, what's best for a project, but I've seen work move forward with incomplete or partial handover. But I've also seen it to where it's like, no, we're going to do it. We're going to wait until it's done correctly. And you don't create additional hazards that you're going to have to face or planned shutdowns. So it's really a double-edged sword. Sometimes you think you're moving forward, but in the long run, it actually costs you work later on down the road. So you're going to have to face it one way or the other. It's just whatever's best for the project.
You're going to have to face it, and that's why you need the industry experts on site in real time to make those game day decisions on what's best to proceed and when some of those deficiencies might be addressed so that work can still progress, but the work is still taking place safely.
Agree. And I can tell you, how to do it safely, but they're the ones they're the ones handling the money and the schedule. So that's over my head. But all I can do is identify those things, hopefully, so that you can make the best decision possible. Right. And those HAZ IDs and stuff like that come in very useful when that comes up.
So Crawford's got a good point here, saying that SimOps meetings are key as our area and site morning meetings. Any best advice you can give people on morning meetings and SimOps meetings?
Yeah, absolutely. So the SimOps meeting is crucial. I mean, everybody needs to be there. In my opinion, one of the things that's changed, it used to be just a face-to-face meeting, but now, like with more projects they're larger, they have more people. Sometimes weather can be an issue, logistics can be an issue. It's nice to have it set up through Teams, right? Because it gives a lot more people an opportunity to be involved. But I agree. So we had a 7:00 morning meeting, what we called a POD, a plan of the day, and then we have a plan of the night as well. But what you're doing in the POD, what was going on is, right after safety, I was the first person to speak. I was going to identify any live electrical work, any confined space, any hot work that was going on, all of my high risk activities. I was going to identify from the day before, what was agreed to in SimOps, saying, okay, these are where my high risk activities are going on. So it was communicated again to all of leadership the next morning in that POD. So I agree. Your POD needs to have the major macro activities talked about every single day too as well. So I agree with Crawford.
Ernesto's got a comment on colors for pre-commissioning or commissioning or even into operation in maintenance. When you talked about colors before, it was more so by group or by discipline. Is there any distinction on phase of the project for commissioning, pre-commissioning, O&M in how you would treat some of the color coding and ownership of areas?
So I can't speak for all projects, but for the ones that I've done, there's never been a distinguishing between pre-commissioning and commissioning. It was either construction, commissioning, or operations. And I know for sure commissioning and operations are going to have their own colors. And then constructions, sometimes they're going to have, but I don't typically see that so much in construction, but in commissioning and operations, you're absolutely going to have what we call, with that either that purple or orange, and then operations is going to have theirs. So visually right away, you're going to know who owns that. But in my opinion, I don't typically see that in construction. There's nothing that's treated as live in the construction world, right? That is the extreme difference between construction and commissioning is you can just go remove the spool piece in construction. It doesn't matter. You can terminate a wire in construction. Nothing's considered to be live, right? So I don't see the need you don't need necessarily a color campaign for construction because there's just no one else there besides construction doing the work, right? To me, that doesn't start until commissioning shows up, but I could be wrong. I don't see that though.
John's got some feedback. Safety is non-negotiable. Really liked your example that you gave of your underwater diving experience. So thanks, John, for your feedback.
Thank you.
Next question. Would you know perhaps if there is a generic control of work recommended procedure that covers details such as the Lotto integration between stakeholders, functions, disciplines, which you have spoken about? A generic control of work recommended procedure. Now, that may be tough to find given that this is always very project specific, but what's your advice on that one?
I feel like OSHA is going to have standards that, are going to absolutely have to be required. We reference particular OSHA standards in our documents. So my advice would just be whatever the OSHA standards are for lockout, tagout, they're not going to define colors or not going to define, what material you have to use per se, but you can find very generic things that are going to be in OSHA standards that would be the first place that I would go.
Crawford's got another point here. In my opinion, the commissioning manager signs all permit to work and Lotto and is the decision maker during the commissioning phase of the project. So certainly, yes, the commissioning manager and the control of work manager need to work hand in hand. How do you see that balanced relationship?
So I 100% agree with that. The commissioning manager or lead, however you want to say it, he 100% has full say-so over my department, and I respect that, and I understand that going into that, right? I'm there to basically eliminate simultaneous operations that are hazardous to each other happening at the same time. It's not to prioritize work. That's the commissioning manager's job. I respect that, but I'm going to work with that person on a daily basis to understand what the priorities are, and hopefully, I'm going to paint that picture for my department on a regular basis so that they understand what we're doing. But I agree, you need to work hand in hand. And typically, yes, they will approve the permits. As far as the lottos go, that's usually done by the discipline lead. But I agree, when you're approving that permit, you're approving that lotto as well, right? So that is correct in that aspect, yes. But 100%, the commissioning manager is the authority in that department.
What are the main roles and responsibilities for the permit to work process? So in this example, the user is asking about permit to work in a fab yard.
So in a fab yard, it's just, to me, it's going to be, it doesn't matter where you're at. I mean, it could be onshore, it could be offshore, it doesn't matter. It just depends on what phase are you at and who owns what system, right? So I don't see that being any different in a fabrication yard. I'm working in a fabrication yard right now. It doesn't change anything. It just matters understanding the ownership and responsibility of where you're at in the construction / commissioning phase. So unless I'm missing something in the question, I don't feel like it's any different where you are. It all works the same to me.
And this question is somewhat related, looking if there's any difference between offshore and onshore in a different approach to safety management, but it would sound like from your previous answer, it's not so much location specific.
Well, the one thing I will say about offshore is, as dynamic as onshore is, you'll never, ever experience anything as dynamic as working offshore. For example, every one of your lifts offshore is a dynamic lift. Basically, you're on a moving vessel, right? It's just, I remember going to sleep after a full day's work, completing my SIMOS meeting. I'm like, okay, we did an awesome job today. And then you wake up the next morning and you find out, okay, the helicopter schedules changed. The grocery boat that was supposed to come in at 2:00 that we planned around, diesel fueling, it's off schedule. Just you name it. There's so many things that can change. And logistically, you expected material to come in. In my opinion, the only difference is the amount of planning you have to do, including logistics as well, for offshore is much, much more difficult than it is in onshore, for sure. And if you've ever been part of with the surf team where you're working for a handover or an integration of a pipeline or a riser or a mooring line, that is really, really involved. A diving campaign, that is super, super complicated versus just a typical onshore activity. So I feel like it's definitely more dynamic for sure.
Hi, Miles. Miles has a question here. How important is compliance in the control work process, and how often does deviation from the process occur, and how do you prevent that?
So one, thank you, Miles. I appreciate it. Miles and I work together. So it can happen every single day. And this is the thing I was telling you about as far as walking through permits and having that relationship and that respect with the commissioning manager, okay? In my opinion, it is so important. There's a reason that those things are in place, right? It may seem like it's slowing down work, but I promise you, it's only to make things safer and to communicate better, right? And, I know Miles and I have the same viewpoint on a lot of things, but sometimes, again, you have opportunities to where, yes, okay, we need to do this. I understand. I see the need to get this work done, but can you do it safely? But here's what you have to remember, okay? If something happens, you need to understand from an audit perspective what they're going to look for. Why did you do this? Okay. Did you shut down this system to do this activity? Did you shut down your UPS system like you were supposed to, or did you keep your UPS system to now you got to do a live permit because you don't want to shut your UPS system down, right? So from an audit perspective, I'm always thinking of, okay, if something happens, and then, so we tend to overthink a lot of things, but we're honestly just trying to think of it from, okay, what happens? So compliance, in my opinion, you really always try to push them a little bit harder. Like, do we really need to do this? Especially for electrical thing, like a live electrical permit, there's 9 standards. And one of the questions that you have to ask is, are you really doing this? Because there's no other way for you to eliminate the electricity. And if it's just you not wanting to shut your facility down, they're going to eat you up on that and be like, that's not why you did this, you know? So we have to look at it from that perspective.
So here's a good question from Mario. When it comes to control of work and SimOps, does the project management group or project management safety group, I think is what's being asked, can they control which work or work that's already taking place in commissioning? I guess the question is aligned, who's the authority when systems are under commissioning's purview? Is that still the project management group or is that the commissioning group?
Well, it's a great question, because obviously as the commissioning manager, you want to support what the project wants to support, correct? But at the same time, you have to do what's safest and what's best for everybody involved. So, I mean, that's a tough question, honestly, because that's going to be something that the commissioning lead has to put themselves into. And as a SimOps manager or as a SimOps coordinator, you just want to do what integrity-wise is the right thing to do. Yes or no, can this be done safely and can this be done ethically? I mean, those are really what, as the manager of SimOps, I'm looking for. But that's a really tough question, Mario. It really is. But I feel like that commissioning manager is going to have a relationship to know what the project really wants to do. And, hey, is this the right thing to do or not? And but to be honest with you, a lot of the people that are in the positions they're in project management, they're there because they do have integrity. They want to do what's right. They sincerely believe that the schedule is important, but there's nothing more important than safety.
And that's why relationships are key, is when we're working with these people and making real-time decisions, we need to be able to know that we can trust and rely on the people that we're working with to make the right decisions.
Completely agree. Yeah, and I feel like if anyone along that chain loses that respect along the way, it's going to be an easy decision to make, because you're going to know what kind of person they are, right? And then know when you need to step up and be like, okay, well, if you're not going to make that decision, then I'll go ahead and make that decision, right?
Yep. So a lot of these procedures, including control of work, they're established very early in the project, which they should be for early project planning. But what situations require maybe to go back and look at some of those plans or adapt as we're getting closer to the work?
A perfect example was that the UPS system and live electrical permits. You know, you made the commitment as a project where you said, okay, we're going to do everything possible not to have live electrical permits, right? And then next thing you know, you're behind schedule. And again, example would be you don't want to shut your UPS system down. And look, there are plenty of people in the electrical world that think it's completely okay to do a live electrical permit, and that's why they're trained. And, you know what I'm saying? But I'm just giving you an example of, yes, there are situations where you agreed to something and then the project as a whole decided they're going to do things differently. That's just one example that I can give you where I've actually seen that happen, and I've seen it actually be performed safely, but it was a major change in just everyone's idea of how things were going to go, right?
So thanks for this. This has been great, Shaun. You've answered everybody's questions, and I'm sure everyone listening has got huge value from your expertise. For anyone that wants to contact you, follow up with you, or learn more about Control of Works, where can they go to reach out to you?
So I have a LinkedIn account. It's just under Shaun DeVille. You'll see I'm with Rev1. It says Control of Works, SimOps, Permit to Work, and Lotto. If anybody, you're welcome to message me on there, and I'll be glad to respond. I'm active on LinkedIn, and I appreciate it.
Great. We'll see you on LinkedIn for sure. This is great, Shaun. Thanks again for sharing your expertise with the world here. Lots of people live viewing. You can see by all the questions and comments that are being asked that there's certainly lots of interest, and everybody appreciates you sharing your expertise today. So we'll end it there for today. Any last comments before we close out?
I just sincerely want to thank you. I want to thank Crawford for giving me this opportunity. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. And, I'm absolutely passionate about this subject. So to be able to talk about it, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure for sure. Everyone have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening. To become a member of the Industrial Commissioning Association, visit icxa.net. Members get access to commissioning standards, procurement specifications, commissioning training and certification, plus many more specialized resources to help you with commissioning of your industrial plant process and energy systems. Visit icxa.net for more information.